Thank you, Chair. My thanks also to Mr. Pulipaka and to ICRIER. The topic that I have been assigned today broadly is nuclear security. I will be looking at the challenges posed to nuclear security in the context of the Asia Pacific. Um, it is generally acknowledged that the international nuclear security regime is not robust or comprehensive enough to deal with the evolving threats of our time. And I believe this macro level template is pretty much applicable to the Asia Pacific as well. There is a wealth of information on the recommendations that ought to be implemented for an effective nuclear security regime. There isn't that much attention afforded to the challenges or the shortcomings that such a regime is facing or could face in the future, and that is what I intend to focus on. So for the purpose of the discussion, I think it would be important to first identify the scope of nuclear security and also to see the geographical limitations of the Asia Pacific. Nuclear security, I think, now has gone well beyond just fissile material security. It also concerns the security of radioactive materials and also the threats that are posed to both nuclear security and fissile material security, radioactive material security, from terrorism, cyber attacks, and other acts of a malicious nature. In terms of the Asia Pacific, there are also definitional challenges, and I think this point has been observed by several speakers before me. It is fluid and contextual, and I think for my presentation, it would make sense to limit myself to South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. As I mentioned earlier, I will be focusing on the challenges that are faced in the implementation of recommendations for an effective nuclear security regime. And for this, I have identified 8 challenges. The first challenge, I think, is that in the Asia Pacific, there is a growing interest in the acquisition or the expansion of the wherewithal for nuclear power. I think that the momentum might have slowed down following Fukushima, but it has not discontinued, which is why this point is still relevant. It means that there might be a greater circulation of fissile material in the region without any sort of effective oversight mechanism, especially one that is cross-border in nature, in the form of proper nuclear security architecture to supervise the circulation of these fissile materials. The second challenge is that Asia also plays host to a number of nuclear armed states, and several of these continue to expand the capacity for fissile material production for weaponization purposes. And this point, I think, inherently demonstrates the trade-off or the play between how much information is enough and how much information is too much information, especially if the nature of information and how much is relevant is decided, let's say, by a perpetrator. On the other hand, you have international assurances about your own nuclear security procedures, and if you decide to not make any information public, then this international confidence in your nuclear security procedures could take a major hit. The bottom line here is that there is no uniform standard for transparency. Different states will perceive the risks that are posed to them differently, and this will determine the kind of attention it receives at the policy level in individual states. Another element in the transparency debate is a possible fear of recrimination or public backlash in case certain standards of nuclear security are made public and these are perceived to be not up to the mark. And this has been demonstrated in the recent past by the Nuclear Threat Initiative's the Nuclear Materials Security Index, in which the example I will cite is that of India's. India has fared very badly on all occasions. And in the specific case of one of the items on the checklist, it essentially uses checklists and indicators to measure compliance of a particular state with the international nuclear security regime and to see how it has fared. Pakistan, in the category of an independent nuclear regulator, has been awarded 100 marks, which is essentially full marks, and India has obviously done very badly in this regard. While I completely agree that there should be an independent nuclear regulator in India, how independent the nuclear regulator in in Pakistan is highly questionable, which is why I think the Indian government believes that these are uninformed studies drawn from open sources and hence should not be subscribed to. Uh, the point here that I'm trying to make is that you cannot have a one-size-fits-all formula for nuclear security for states across the spectrum. The third challenge complicates the scenario even further in the Asia Pacific, and these are the vulnerable geopolitical realities that the region faces. You have, firstly, the presence of non-state actors, subconventional warfare, allegations of state-sponsored terrorism, which is a very dangerous scenario for a weak nuclear security regime, with the possibility of materials and know-how falling into the wrong hands or being deliberately being handed to potential perpetrators. In addition to these, relatively lax border controls, which of course makes the prospect of illicit trafficking very attractive and gives it an added impetus. And I think these three challenges, which is that of the pursuit and acquisition of nuclear power in the region, the number of nuclear armed states that are present, and therefore the play-off between transparency and secrecy, and finally the volatility of the geopolitics of the region, form a very alarming trifecta of threats that are posed to nuclear security in the Asia Pacific. The fourth challenge, I would say, is that the nuclear security regime is weak because it has sort of taken a backseat to other international regimes that govern, say, for instance, safety, safeguards, arms control, etc. And this is primarily because nuclear security has traditionally been viewed as a national concern of a sovereign state, and technical experts residing in these sovereign states have then decided what the requirements for nuclear security in that state are. What this has done is that it has relegated political will, which is a very important component of constructing an international regime, to the back burner. Of course, with the initiation of the Nuclear Security Summit process in 2010, this was given a global flavor. But I don't know how long this momentum will last, given that it is going to end the process with its last installment very soon. We should also note that these regimes are by no way, this regime is by no way universal or binding, and there is no way to ensure compliance, enforcement, or implementation. Some, I think, might argue that even if you have a comprehensive, effective international nuclear security regime, cheating will happen regardless, going by the precedent of what has happened under the aegis of other international regimes. And against this argument, I would say that cheating itself can be an enforcer. If a regime is to detect an instance of cheating, that can be used as a reinforcement mechanism to bolster the regime itself and revalidate its principles and instruments. The fifth challenge is that the various conventions and obligations that make up this very fragmented international security regime, whether they're UN mandated or by the IAEA or ad hoc mechanisms, and they look at security at the source, in transit, disposal, nuclear security culture, the legal requirements, emergency preparedness and response, etc., are all voluntary and the prerogative of sovereign states. Therefore, participation is uneven, and there is no consistency in the adoption of different elements of the regime by individual states. Often, this is because there are charges of these initiatives being politically motivated, which brings me to my next point, the sixth point, which is the specific political and cultural challenges of different states or different regions. And in this, I think what becomes relevant is all conflicts over disarmament and non-proliferation, where states have held the perception that they were shortchanged and that it is inherently unfair, and they would expect, therefore, another regime to be more of the same, which would then lead them to say that we will abide by our own very comprehensive national security standards, which will run on a parallel to the international security track, and they will be comprehensive enough, and we don't have to comply with rules that have been mandated by someone else. The seventh challenge is the limitations of resources and personnel, especially in reference to smaller states. This has two elements. First is that adhering to all mechanisms could have or could be perceived to have a negative impact on the limited resources and personnel available to smaller states. These smaller states, especially if they have no direct linkage to nuclear security, which is, let's say, manufacturing, storage, or transport, they might say that this would require them to go above and beyond the call of duty and make commitments, make the same commitments as a bigger nuclear armed state. The argument against this proposition is that one must always swear by the dictum that the international nuclear security regime would only be as strong as the weakest link in its chain. In addition, radioactive materials are really available everywhere. Most countries in Southeast Asia host research reactors. And if one considers the possibility of a cyber attack, that respects no boundaries or borders at all. The second element of this point is that significant portions of these conventions and obligations overlap, which makes an already weak regime even less effective. And of course, these overlaps must be removed at some point in some manner to make it more cohesive. Another point to note here is that there is this overlap between different portions of conventions and obligations because nuclear security or the vision for nuclear security was not implemented as part of a larger picture, as a cohesive whole. Most of them were ad hoc responses, leading to lots of overlap in the instruments that were implemented. Finally, my eighth and final point is whether the momentum created by the Nuclear Security Summit process will persist after its last installment, which is to be held in Washington, D.C. in 2016. For many states, the incentive here was really the high political visibility afforded to them by the NSS process and the international goodwill they earned by making various voluntary contributions. Operative here, I think that all these contributions were voluntary. Many of them were made as gifts. And it remains to be seen whether these states that have made these commitments and have championed the cause of nuclear security, global nuclear security, would continue to champion it with the same enthusiasm once the NSS process comes to an end. And if it does come to an end, which organization or what instrument or body do we see taking over to look after the cause of nuclear security globally? I think what these 8 challenges do is highlight the importance of nuclear security in the global nuclear order. Nuclear security mutually reinforces the goals of nuclear non-proliferation as well as nuclear disarmament. And in order to uphold the notions of accountability and transparency, which are considered really the 2 pillars of nuclear security, it is important to create a format that would be acceptable to all stakeholders for the regime to be implemented properly or be effective at all. Thank you.